When Apple originally launched the M1 based MacBook Pros and Macs, the understanding was that while on the lower end side of things, the M1 will replace Intel's chips, higher end machines will continue to have the Intel chip inside. A few months in, and one thing is for sure, the M1 chip already outperforms most Intel based Macs. Now, we've had the MacBook Pro M1 for a little over 2 months, and initially, while I had reservations about switching to a machine like this, it seems and it is apparent that it is becoming more and more likely. Let's get started with this video. Now, if you want to start off with the M1 chip, the cheapest barrier to entry is the Mac Mini, which starts at around 65,000 rupees. And it has the full capability of the M1 chip. In fact, it is even more performance oriented because of the cooling capabilities than the M1 MacBook Pro. The cheapest MacBook at the moment with the M1 chip is the MacBook Air at a starting price of 92,000 rupees. This allows you to experience the M1 in a MacBook format, but because it is not actively cooled, it does have its limitations. For the purposes of this video, it is essential to explain that for the longest time, I've been a iMac fan, and I've been using the iMac Pro with an 18-core Xeon W chip for almost 2 years now. This is a fully loaded model and has 128 gigabytes of RAM and also a terabyte storage, which is an NVMe SSD, and then it is also connected to my RAID system. And my laptop of choice has been the last generation Core i9 15-inch MacBook Pro. I've simply been a 15-inch user simply because of the size of the display and because of the sheer performance of the 15-inch MacBook Pros have been providing for the past many years, and now I was planning to upgrade to the 16-inch MacBook Pro. One of the biggest changes for switching to this machine have been the smaller screen size. But despite being only a 13.3-inch display, it's a 2560 by 1600 pixel display. So you still get that Retina resolution. And Apple uses some of the best displays in the industry. And this screen is absolutely fantastic, whether you're viewing content, just browsing, doing a lot of text-related work because the screen is so sharp. But more importantly, for things like video editing and color correction or photo editing, this display is absolutely fantastic. And that's just it. Primarily, I've been using a few apps in the past couple of years, and those include Apple Mail, Final Cut Pro, Safari, and Photoshop. These are the most commonly used applications on my MacBook or iMac, and those are the apps that I wanted to use on the M1 MacBook Pro as well. But the only thing is that while 3 out of these 4 applications are made by Apple and they had support for the Apple Silicon M1 chip already, my biggest concern was support for Adobe apps, including Photoshop. And while Adobe has only released betas and only Lightroom in a full support for the Apple M1, the version that I do have works really well on the M1 MacBook, and it almost launches instantly. And that's just the thing. The biggest difference in moving from an Intel-based machine to the M1 MacBook is almost the feeling of using apps on the smartphone. When you launch an app, it instantly launches. When you switch between an app, it instantly switches. And those are things that you typically see on smartphones and tablets. And that's the kind of experience you're getting with the M1 MacBook Pro as well. Another big advantage of the Apple M1 based Macs in general, and this MacBook Pro as well, is that apps like Final Cut Pro can take advantage of Apple's M1 Silicon architecture, which means that for apps that have both CPU and GPU related tasks, the M1, which has the CPU, GPU, and the memory all on the same die, these processes can happen much faster. So rendering times on things like Final Cut Pro, even with heavier 4K clips, is much faster than the 18-core 36-thread iMac Pro that I have, and that just absolutely boggles my mind. That machine has 128 gigabyte of RAM, whereas this one has only 16 gigabyte of RAM. This not only improves your workflow in general, but this also makes it portable. And that is one of the biggest advantages of a machine like this, is because it not only replaces the performance of the desktop computer that I have, but it also makes it a portable desktop replacement for when I do decide to travel, hopefully when it happens this year. Another thing that is vastly improved is the new keyboard, and in comparison to the 15-inch MacBook that I previously owned, the keyboard is far more tactile and has a better travel, and the keys have a more reassuring click. And the keyboard in general is easy to type on for long periods of time, and the keys seem much less mushier in comparison to what I had with the 15-inch MacBook. In fact, they're actually much more tactile and much more comfortable to use. Now, battery life is another thing that's seen a massive improvement with the M1 chip, and with the MacBook Pro M1, particularly the battery life has been pretty phenomenal. I get on average a full day worth of use, and in most cases, if I'm not using the laptop too much, I will find that I don't need to charge the MacBook for a few days in, and that's just the comfort of having a machine that functions like a tablet. So whenever you lift the screen, the machine turns on, and whenever you turn off the screen, it goes into a extremely low power state, wherein which it behaves like a smartphone does, and it doesn't really utilize any battery. And because of the massive battery that's in the machine already, you get pretty impressive screen on times and pretty impressive usage times, and you'll get almost a full day worth of use from the MacBook Pro M1. One thing that I could definitely use more of are USB ports. The MacBook Pro 13-inch only has 2 ports, and if I'm charging the machine, it takes up one of those USB-C ports, so I'm left with only one, and that's just a little bit of a downside of this. And if you're somebody who uses and plugs in a lot of peripherals and dongles and things like that, this may definitely not be the machine for that, because you're definitely not equipped with a lot of ports. This is very limited. You can use a hub or an adapter, but there have been compatibility issues with the new M1 MacBook. So bear in mind before you go ahead and purchase the M1 MacBook Pro. And while this is not the first time Apple has shown off its capability as a hardware manufacturer, what the M1 chip on the MacBook and the new Mac Mini does show is that while Apple has replaced the lower end line of machines, it is more than ready to replace its entire lineup with its own chips. And with some news already surfacing of the next generation Apple chips, it means that the higher end versions of these machines will turn out to be extremely more powerful. The M1 MacBook Pro and the Mac Mini are excellent entry point machines that actually replace a lot of other machines that exist today. In my case, the M1 MacBook Pro has already replaced my iMac Pro with an 18-core processor and 128 gigabytes of RAM, and my 15-inch MacBook Pro, which is a Core i9 and 32 gigabytes of RAM. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, if you found it helpful, don't forget to smash the like button. Hit the subscribe button if you're not already a part of Team iGyaan. This has been Bharat. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one.